Eliot Higgins. He's the founder of Bellingcat and a real pioneer in using open source intelligence to do investigative journalism. So with that, Eliot, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about the work we've been doing on the conflict in Ukraine. Really, we've been doing this work since 2014 when we started our investigations into MH17. Back then, Bellingcat was basically me and a few volunteers who came together around what happened with MH17. And we then spent the next, really ever since, the next 9 years learning more and more about open source investigation, the preservation of material, why that's important. But alongside that, we were also part of a community that grew around various ideas. Some were interested in just the conflict itself, some around human rights, investigations, and other areas. And really, with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, what we've seen is a lot of these ideas really become mainstreamed. It's the first time I've really seen open source investigation being key to understanding a conflict, and that being understood by actors such as mainstream media and international accountability bodies, that there is a value in using open source evidence. But there's been developments since 2014. The social media platforms people use have changed. Some of the opportunities for investigations have been shut down. But with the invasion, we could actually see the buildup of it because TikTok has become very popular. And in Russia, there were lots and lots of people who were seeing interesting things like military vehicles driving down their streets, which they would then film and share online, often with the rough location of where it was. And because of our work on MH17 and our work since, we've become very aware of the value of archiving and preserving this material and making sure it's also searchable. This is a map that was put together by the Centre for Information Resilience. They're an organisation we've worked with in the past. And they've basically taken as many videos as they can from the conflict in Ukraine, and they've mapped them out. So what you're seeing here are just the videos from the period prior to the invasion of Russian military vehicles. And each of these dots represents an individual video. So most of them are in Russia, some of them are in Russian-occupied Crimea and eastern Ukraine as well. And what they did is they geolocated these videos so they would be searchable in the future, and you can go back and actually see the original source of these videos, and these have also been archived and preserved. And a lot of these efforts were coming from online communities that kind of formed immediately around the conflict. Twitter actually has been for a long time pretty much the open source investigation communities platform. Unfortunately, there's changes being made to Twitter that I think might put that at risk. But this is where a lot of these conversations were happening. And part of those conversations were people looking at the claims being made by various sides in the conflicts. So the video I'm about to show you was uploaded by the Donetsk People Republic, the Russian-backed separatist republic, before the invasion. And it claims to show saboteurs attacking a chlorine storage tank. And this is the video they shared. So what you can actually see there isn't actually that much. It's basically grass, the front of a gun, and some apparent gunfire. And it was posted on Telegram along with this message, which basically explained the situation. Most importantly, is the claim that they were targeting a chlorine storage tank, trying to blow it up. They're apparently Polish saboteurs for some reason, and they were working to blow this place up, and they were killed, their equipment was captured, and this is apparently footage from their body camera that was captured. The problem is the Donetsk People's Republic don't realize one pretty crucial difference between Telegram and most other social media platforms. Is that when you upload stuff to most social media platforms, it strips the metadata. And that is not the case with Telegram. This is just a tiny sample of some of the metadata that was part of this video. And the reason there's so much metadata is because the file was created in an Adobe product that added lots and lots of additional metadata. This is effectively a blueprint to how the entire file was created. And there's interesting things in the blueprint because it has the creation date, which is about 10 days before the event took place, which is obviously the first sign something's up. We can see that the project path as well, and we can see the actual project was started in 2022. So this is some old file they've kind of drug out. We can see exactly what it was edited on. And this is really interesting. So this pantry ingredients file path. First thing you have to do is when you see this is look at what a pantry ingredient is. And what it is actually a file that was used as part of the final video. So we copy and pasted that name. This is something that people on Twitter were doing and kind of digging through, and searched for that on YouTube, because if you ever download videos from YouTube using popular apps, they usually just use the video name as the file. And we found this. This is a video from 10 years ago. And basically this whole online kind of community formed around this and picking this apart. And this video is actually the source of the explosion you heard in the video. They basically cut out the explosion and added it to the video. Someone on Twitter who had audio analysis background looked at the waveform of this video and the one in the fake video, and they were identical, apart from one bit, because in this video, there's an explosion and the soldiers watching, they cheer. But in the fake video, they cut it off just as the soldiers are cheering. So what was important about this is not that it was debunked, which was important, but it was debunked very, very quickly. Within an hour, it had been completely debunked. And it stopped this particular claim entering the kind of information ecosystem, because even the people who are kind of the most pro-Russian, anti-Western types will not use a video if it's been debunked 5 minutes after it's published. And what's really made a difference now with, compared to, say, 2014, is that there is a pre-existing community who understands things like metadata, open source investigation, geolocation, who will take these videos and just tear them apart in seconds if they're fake. And we had several examples of this throughout the conflicts already. Another part of this community is people just started geolocating videos. So geolocation is using different reference information to verify the location of a video or photograph. And you have people like GeoConfirmed, which has been now running for more than a year, just a community of volunteers who are geolocating videos. And for us, that's very useful because it saves us a huge amount of time. One of the things we decided to do with this conflict is try and archive and map as many videos as possible, similar to the Centre for Information Resilience map. And we have a platform we use called Atlas. So basically what this allows us to do is we have a small community of trained volunteers, trained in geolocation, but also with vicarious trauma training, because we owe them their kind of psychological well-being. And this basically allows us to create tasks that people can claim and geolocate. And these are very simple tasks. But because there's already that pre-existing community of people geolocating videos out in the open, that's kind of become part of our workflow. We'll take those videos and then we can double check the geolocation using this platform. Because they've already provided the coordinates, it means that rather than taking 2 or 3 hours to figure out where something was taken, it's just double checking what they've already done. And it saves us a vast amount of time. We have this map available at ukraine.bellingcat.com. That is an incidence of civilian harm that we've mapped out. This is a public data set. It's available for anyone to download and use and examine. We have a delay built into when we're actually publishing this stuff because we don't want to provide Russia with free intelligence on what they're blowing up. So we put a delay in. We also look at videos where there's a potential for witnesses or victims to be identified, and we put those in a private data set we only share with human rights and accountability organizations. So that's not public. But this is really something that we've done just because from my experience with working on Syria, there was so much content that was shared from Syria that's lost or badly archived, or it's been downloaded, but it doesn't have any way to search it because there's no coordinates or other metadata with it. So this was an attempt to solve those issues. But even though there's all these efforts to verify and fact check, there's still lots of disinformation that's floating around. One of those was related to a hospital bombing near the start of the conflict, where you had 2 photographs that became quite controversial. One is a pregnant woman walking down the stairs after it's been bombed, and another is a pregnant woman being carried away. And what started happening is you had social media accounts claiming that this was either the same person, that the person was claimed to have died, but they hadn't actually died, various claims. And you can see these are kind of quite minor Twitter accounts. These are the sort of Twitter accounts that nowadays buy blue ticks rather than being awarded them originally. But we have the Russian Embassy of the UK using these same claims. Basically, a lot of people, when they talk about disinformation, they often see it as outside actors and what they're doing to us. What I've always found interesting about Russia is often they're just stealing ideas off the internet and repeating them. It's not sophisticated, it's not clever, but we've never been very good at responding to that. But now, because we've had all these years of experience and these communities have developed and we understand fact-checking and verification, there's more of a pushback. This is a clip of the Russian ambassador to the Netherlands on a Dutch news show talking about some of these claims. And I want you to pay particular attention to the sources he uses off the victim's Instagram page there as his evidence that it's faked. They were two different women. One of them died along with their unborn child, unfortunately. But even with this being thoroughly debunked repeatedly over the last year, Russia still uses this claim in their disinformation. But because we've done so much work at Bellingcat to train other organizations, develop these networks, we've trained, I think, over 6,000 people now to do open source investigation. We have major media like CNN, for example, building their own open source investigation teams where they look at these attacks using the investigation techniques that we've developed. And that's really kind of one of the key aims I had with Bellingcat was to spread the use of open source investigation techniques because it's evidence-based, it's thorough and it's detailed, but it's also a really good way to engage people with the work that you're doing because you have this visual imagery. And I've seen more and more major media organizations over the last year setting up open source investigation teams because they understand now that to understand modern conflicts, to ignore open source information, to think it's some secondary thing, is just a bad business idea because it's loads of free material for your journalists to look at from the comfort of their office without expensive budgets around sending people away. So this is a hugely valuable way of investigating stuff. Something else that's changed as well is the availability of the information that we have. 10 years ago, when we were looking at satellite imagery, for example, we had to use Google Earth, and that meant the imagery was often 9 months, a year, 2 years out of date. But now we've had a different situation. So this is footage from a beach in Crimea, where there was an airstrike or an explosion at an airbase, and obviously the Russians weren't taking photographs of their blown-up aircraft, but because we have access to satellite imagery, we're able to, this is the area that was attacked, we could see the damage the following day because we have access to satellite imagery on a daily basis now. So this means we can immediately fact check and verify what's happening on the ground in these locations where there's airstrikes. Now Bellingcat even has access to tasking satellites. We have every month we have 5 satellite taskings we can send anywhere in the world if you want to just see what's happening there. And it's just as good a resolution as you would see on something like Google Earth, so it's really great for research. There were other denials as well. I will say there is some slightly graphic imagery in this next section, so just to be prepared. So Bucha was obviously a very notorious incident near the start of the conflict where when Ukrainian forces entered the town, there were bodies on the streets that had just been laying out there for a very long time. But there were various denials that came from, first of all, as usual, random people on Twitter coming up with ideas about bodies moving and it all being fake, and then that being repeated by the Russian embassy. So one of the key claims is that a corpse in a video, their hand moved across their body to show that they were just pretending. And you can actually watch the video itself, and this is the video, and you'll see it's actually a water droplet that's moving across the windshield as they drive by. And this is just typical. Basically, you have all these conspiracy theorists, pro-Russian fringe types on Twitter, crowdsourcing every possible excuse for this to be fake, and then kind of the Russian diplomatic corps basically picking up the ones that they'll repeat. What we have, though, because of satellite imagery, is imagery prior to the Ukrainians entering the town, which is part of the conspiracy is that Ukraine actually killed these people or they placed them there or they're actors working with the Ukrainians. But satellite imagery showed that these bodies were there weeks before the Ukrainians arrived. we actually now have lots of reporting from various sources, in particular the New York Times, who used multiple sources, like drone imagery, for example, that shows Russian forces. They had CCTV footage from people's various cameras. They had people who were filming from their windows. And they took all this information and they were able to piece it together and identify not only the Russian units that were involved, but the individual commanders who were involved with rounding up civilians and killing them. But on a more lighter side, we have a different kind of community that's formed. You may have encountered the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, which is basically a meme-based, humorous response to disinformation. When you work on topics around conflict for a long time, it can get quite dispiriting that no matter how good you do your job, no matter how many details you've got, how much evidence you present, you'll always have the Russian diplomats coming back saying, oh, it's all fake news, it's not real, here's something I found on Twitter that proves it's wrong. And it's often hard to respond to that as a fairly professional person, but you now have this whole community online that's kind of come together under this flag, really, that just really trolls the living daylights out of any Russian diplomat or anyone who says this kind of stuff. They do it in a humorous way, and it's very difficult for Russia to respond to that because they insist on being taken seriously. And when they respond to this kind of stuff, they just look ridiculous. What it's also meant is a website called St. Javelin was launched to, first of all, sell stickers and then sell more and more branded merchandise to this community, which has been used to raise over $1 million so far for Ukraine. So this actually is another aspect of these online communities that come together. And I mean, there's a lot of work being done by online communities, but there's also the more serious work of investigations for legal accountability. So one thing we started looking at 4 years ago is how do you actually use open source evidence in courtrooms? Because no one's really answered that question in a way that is satisfactory to any of the courts who actually use it, because it's such a new field of investigation. We started a project that was focused on Yemen, where we developed a process with an organization called the Global Legal Action Network to investigate war crimes and incidents of civilian harm using open source evidence in a way that would actually be usable in a courtroom environment. It's something that's taken us a long time to develop. It's very complicated, as you can imagine, because of the thoroughness that you need to do with this. To give you a rough idea, we're doing investigations at the moment into incidents in Ukraine that took place last year in Kharkiv. A typical report from our more editorial reports, the stuff we publish on the website a day or a week after the event, might be 2 or 3 pages long. If you're doing it for legal accountability, these reports are close to 100 pages long, because you have to document, you've looked at absolutely every possible thing you could look at. And it's something you have to document very carefully. It's a very, very long process. But it's something that's actually working really, really well. We've published 2 reports so far for the kind of legal accountability community with the Global Legal Action Network that addresses a lot of the issues that have been raised time and time again. And one thing I want to do now, and we're working on at the moment, is a project called the Index for Accountability. Because one thing we encountered with the conflict in Syria is you had lots of small organizations, usually kind of volunteer-led, who were saving videos from the conflict, or they were on the ground collecting digital evidence. And the problem became is you ended up with loads of people with different archives of materials, saved to different standards, using different metadata schema, and it was a kind of a horrible mess. When the IIIM on Syria was set up, that is a UN General Assembly organization or mandated organization to collect evidence on what's happened in Syria, the problem they encountered is that most of these organizations didn't want to share their data. They don't want to hand over their hard drives, their digital evidence to one centralized organization. And that was a problem because this organization wanted that evidence. They wanted to preserve it. They wanted to archive it. So we had to come up with an alternative solution. We're working on a system at the moment that allows us to index multiple archives using an indexing system developed by Bellingcat, which creates unique IDs for videos and photographs based off their content. The idea is then we're going to be able to create a centralized searchable index that allows end users like the International Criminal Court, for example, to search this index and then create requests directly with the archive holders for that archived material, so it can be sent directly, and they have full control over the archive material they have. They know who they're sharing it with. They have a way to track what access there's been to the material that they've got. We're hoping within the next few months to have a working prototype of that. I had hoped to show it to you today, but as with all things tech development, it takes a bit longer than you imagine. So maybe next year I'll come and show you the result of that work. But yeah, that's really kind of the big goal for us next. And yeah, that's Bellingcat. So I'm more than happy to answer any of the questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for that, Eliot. So before I open this up to the floor, I'd like to ask a few questions of my own, if I may. So much of the examples that you give are about when there is a fact, and then you and your team and all the volunteers, they debunk. Or in the case of the trolling, also try to, let's say, discredit the sender of the information. But I was curious, are there also things that we can do to actually prevent people from buying into conspiracy theories in the first place? And do you think that Bellingcat also has a role to play there?
Yeah. So my belief is that a lot of the reasons people get drawn into conspiracy theories is often they have what I like to call a traumatic moral injury. So it's something that's offended them so much that they start seeing the entire world through that particular lens. You can see that happening on a whole range of different topics. I've worked on things like chemical weapon use in Syria, MH17, COVID disinformation, and you see this kind of same formation of these opinions and communities around these different topics, where you have people who have a deep distrust of sources of authority, which change from topic to topic, but they find like-minded people online who reinforce those ideas. They say, yes, you're right, here's more information that proves you're right, and people are saying, great, I'm right, here's the information, I'll just keep believing this. And a lot of this is sometimes legitimate. So when I was working on stuff to do with Syrian chemical attacks, a lot of the loudest voices who are kind of angry about allegations that Assad's been using chemical weapons are people who were very deeply affected by the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where the UK and US governments lied about the circumstances around weapons of mass destruction. And this is the thing, these are not illegitimate concerns. These are not things that they shouldn't be angry about, but it starts defining their entire worldview. So when they start hearing about chemical weapons in Syria, they think, oh, this is just WMDs in Iraq again. It's the mainstream media colluding with the Western governments to pull the wool over my eyes. And then they go on the internet and they find like-minded people who say, yes, you're correct. And it's not always that you start kind of with the most extreme version of those beliefs. You might be worried about, for example, COVID vaccines. Are they safe? You go to Google and you Google, are COVID vaccines safe? And that's going to recommend sites, or at least it used to recommend sites before they got wise to this, that are usually communities of people who are very concerned about vaccine safety. So there's an inherent bias within that already. So you go to those communities and you might see a range of opinions in that community you start exploring. It might start off, at the lower end, it might be vaccines, they have additives that it might be bad if you take them all at the same time. That's a kind of like mild version of it. And then there's people who are saying they cause various illnesses. Some people say they're designed to cause various illnesses by big pharma so they can make more money from you. Then there's the Bill Gates is putting microchips in the vaccines. I mean, we carry smartphones everywhere. Why would he need to do that? But the thing is, you don't start off with the most extreme version of those views. You get exposed to these different levels of views and information that is meant to support that. And then it's basically you're on the path to radicalization. And most people do get off before it gets really crazy, but you always have a percentage that moves on to the most crazy version of those ideas. And they tend to be loud, aggressive, fairly immune to facts as well. So once they get to that point, once they cross that threshold, it's really, really hard to reach them because they've already become quite isolated by the nature of the people they spend their time with. I mean, if you're going around saying Bill Gates is putting microchips in vaccines, if you're telling that to your friends and family, they're probably going to think you're a bit weird. So you start being more and more isolated into the communities that agree with you. So how do we stop that from happening? Well, in my mind, it's about giving people the opportunity to have a positive impact on topics that they care about, rather than go on the internet and screaming at people they don't like and finding people who agree with them. How do they actually address those issues themselves? One thing we're doing in the UK at the moment is we're building a school curriculum around open source investigation, fact-checking, critical thinking, with the hope of creating pop-up newsrooms in schools where young people will be able to investigate topics that impact them directly. We're working with an organisation called the Student View, who've already been doing this kind of work, doing things like freedom of information requests with students about what the local police are up to and stuff like that. And they've had real impact with that. And I find that something that's more empowering than just going on the internet and getting mad about stuff. It's actually saying, okay, how do you actually find the evidence? How do you present that evidence? How do you get impact from that? And I think it's better to kind of deal with the symptoms early on rather than kind of trying to cure it when it's a cancer that's just spread through every part of their body.
Yeah, thank you very much. So kind of leads me to my second question. So Apple in its opening address showed examples of synthetic media, ChatGPT, DALL-E, but also like Midjourney is now incapable of making, very sort of high-res imagery, also moving images. And I was wondering how synthetic media is impacting the work that you do.
It hasn't really. I mean, I got banned for Midjourney, so it did impact me somewhat. I find it interesting about the images that you can create. The thing is, with this kind of work of kind of evidence-based investigation, if you have an image, you can do like geolocation. Midjourney cannot make images of locations that are accurate. So if you geolocate it, you'll never find a match for it. So that's one way to eliminate the fake. I have experimented a lot with things like Midjourney. I created a thread on Twitter where it was basically images of Donald Trump getting arrested. So he was kind of fighting with the police, running away from the police. Like Eric Trump was crying, he was in court crying. Like I could create this whole narrative of him going to prison, getting his orange jumpsuit, escaping from prison like the Shawshank Redemption. And then he runs off and he's running through the rain at night and he runs into a McDonald's and he grabs a burger and then he's a picture of him crying, eating it. And that was all created using Midjourney. And if you look at them at first glance, they all seem pretty convincing. It's when you start looking at the small details, stuff becomes, stranger and stranger. But I got banned from Midjourney for publishing that after it went viral, unfortunately. I mean, even weeks later, I still get like Japanese journalists kind of like emailing me, asking me questions about it, and I just kind of want to move on from the whole thing. But what really surprised me is they get really mad that you're using Midjourney to create images of Donald Trump or any other celebrities. But they train Midjourney on images of celebrities. I mean, where's their responsibility when it comes to using other people's images? We've had this thing recently where Drake has had a song made entirely from AI using his voice. And the question is, where is the responsibility for the people who are training these networks to actually say, actually, let's not use people's images. I made, for example, an image of Tom Cruise in the role of Donald Trump in a completely fictional film. And it was a convincing image. He made a good Donald Trump. It had his hair and everything, but Tom Cruise's face. But with ChatGPT as well, what concerns me more there is that it's very good at rewriting other people's stuff. So in the past, I've encountered websites where they basically steal lots of content off of a website, change it slightly, like they change the name of the kind of, if it mentions Reuters, they put their own website name in there. And they'll run that website for months and months and months, and then they start putting fake stories into the website. That would be really, really easy to do with ChatGPT, because now, rather than, you can just say, okay, just scan the API wire, get it to rewrite it, publish it onto the website. You can automate all of that, really. You can even, I actually use, when we're publishing articles on Bellingcat, I'll often copy and paste the article into ChatGPT and get it to create a Twitter thread just to save me the time of trying to get exactly 280 characters. And it does that really, really well. It's really good at rewriting stuff, but if you automate that whole process, you could basically have an entire fake news network running automatically at scale with very little human interaction needed, and then setting up all this kind of backstory, really, that these sites need to then start actually pushing out fake stories that can influence things. But ChatGPT is also a fantastic tool. I use it quite a lot in my work to save myself time writing stuff and correcting my spelling and grammar.
You mentioned that like some of the fact checks that you can do now within minutes. And you mentioned that it's important to get the correct information out fast. Do you think that as these synthetic media get better, this might actually cause this 5 minutes to become longer, because there is sort of cat and mouse perhaps between the entities making this information and you and your team detecting it, let's say?
It's kind of like we're building these communities, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, who respond to this kind of disinformation very quickly. So if we keep doing that, that's one way to offset the damage that it can do. On the other hand, I think social media companies need to have more and more integrated systems to actually check whether or not images appear to be fake or manipulated, and start highlighting those, because it is becoming more of a issue. One thing we did when we were creating the images of Trump and various celebrities is we used facial recognition software to see if we could, if there was any difference. And that gave remarkably high results, like 99.9% matches, which is something you wouldn't even get with 2 photographs of the same person. It's very, it's actually an interesting discrepancy that it's almost too good at recreating famous people's faces. But yeah, I mean, this is something that I think as these systems develop and they grow and there's more capabilities built around AI art packages, you're going to find, I think, more and more fake images.
Can we still look at your images that you created with Donald Trump being arrested and having a little snack?
The whole story is still on Twitter. If you,
okay,
I think it's my name and Trump arrested or arrest,
okay,
and
good.
you'll find it.
I have one more question before I open it up to the floor. So I know that also in your presentation you gave the example about collaborating with Global Leading Action Network, but also you've been working with Spiegel and Lighthouse Reports. So these collaborations with journalistic entities. And I was curious, this audience full of esteemed archivists and librarians, if what kind of collaboration do you foresee between the work that you do and the archival community?
Well, I mean, we've been involved with organisations archiving material for conflicts for quite a while. Nomadic Labs, for example, in Berlin, they've been archiving all the material we've collected from Ukraine, and I think it's one of these situations where a community has kind of emerged from the conflict in Syria that is made up of a whole range of different organisations, but we didn't really connect to your community. We kind of, in a way, I wouldn't say went around it, but developed a completely separate thing. And I think that community needs to start talking more and more to your community, basically, because there's a lot of opportunities that do get missed because people just don't think to talk to each other. Even very early on, when I was doing my first kind of year or so of blogging, I would have, say, someone from Human Rights Watch reach out, and then a journalist reach out, and an arms expert reach out about the same thing. And I was always thinking, why aren't these 3 people talking to each other? They obviously share the same interests. And I started connecting people together. And these collaborations come from this idea that it's not just about let's find another journalist we can work with. It's like, who are all the organisations who are working on this topic who we can collaborate with, irregardless of whether they're journalists or an NGO or an individual who's just really obsessed about the topic. Can we find the best people to work with to basically find a solution or find the answer to what we're investigating?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So questions from the audience. There's one. Okay, let's start. I'm notoriously bad at throwing this mic. I've done it in the past and it's really ridiculous. So I'm just going to hand it to you and then we can do the throwing later.
Does it actually work?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. It's really great. We are presenting here a bit of work that we've done into the kind of dangers of archiving. Sort of more broadly with web preservation. We didn't get to talk a lot to people from the OSINT communities because we were doing the research around the time that the Russian invasion happened. And so, doing interviews with people who are already very busy was very difficult. My question, I'd have dozens of questions for you, but one of them would be, can you list off the top of your head some ways in which the kind of siloing of platforms, both the kind of source platforms, but also everything from operating systems through the platforms that Bellingcat has either developed or co-developed, the ways in which navigation or moving material between them is overwhelming or difficult, like those friction points that you see there?
It has been a challenge over the years because it's one thing to drop some links into a spreadsheet when you're kind of working on something, but then coming back to that and turning it into ordered information is a lot more difficult. So in a sense, at each step of the process, we've created different solutions for what we're trying to do. So, for example, the problem we had with kind of mass geolocation of videos was solved using the Atlas platform and creating this process where we're drawing from those communities on social media who are already doing that kind of crowdsourced geolocation of videos to make that process far more efficient. That then feeds into a database we've created, which is drawn on by the archive mnemonic Labs holds. They basically look at the links, they archive them using a hash, they take the metadata that we've added to that, and that allows them to start indexing and collecting this stuff in a kind of more straightforward fashion. Part of the reason I take this kind of modular approach to each stage of that process, because in some incidents, all you're doing is really just geolocating videos and putting them on a database and then mapping them out. That's one process. Each part of that process, you can have a different kind of module, a different system for doing that before it moves on to the next one. But you then might have to integrate more, for example, legal accountability process focused stuff on that. So in our case, we have this additional process on the end of that initial process, which goes into the Uwazi evidentiary database that is specifically designed around legal accountability and making that accessible for that. So because, as I say, we collaborate with different types of organizations, they have different needs and requirements. So you kind of have to almost create this whole system around just slotting things in and out that work. They all have to kind of be consistent with each other as well. You can't have something in there that just doesn't work with the thing before it and the thing after it. And that takes a lot of work, but I mean, we've done a lot of work to actually get there with this specific kind of investigation. So yeah, I mean, when we've developed this a bit further, we're planning to have kind of more kind of conferences and talks at conferences explaining exactly how we do that process and what we found the benefits of that to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next? More questions? I was actually wondering how do you actually coordinate the work across the community? You have staff, but then you mentioned you trained thousands of people. How do you go about organizing an investigation?
So we have a kind of organizational kind of onion around that. So you have about 6 layers of that. You have in the center the kind of main Bellingcat team, which is effectively our staff, where we obviously have a lot of direct control over what people want to do and an understanding of what they're doing. Then we have regular contributors to the website and to our research who aren't our staff, but they're engaged a lot all the time. We then have our trained volunteer network who use Atlas, for example. So that's kind of those 3 central layers are where we have control. We can organize those layers. If we're planning a project, we can say, okay, this is what each of those layers would be doing in that project. The next layer outside of that is basically the online community that's kind of emerged around Bellingcat. That could be people who follow us on Twitter very closely and get engaged with stuff on Twitter. It could be various individuals and organizations that we know and we work with occasionally. That's kind of the first of the less organized layers. Then the next layer of that are just the broader online community who engage with open source investigation topics. And then you have the kind of broader internet beyond that. What you can do with each of those layers is actually say, how do we interact with those layers? How do we engage them? So if you have a task that's very simple, but there's a lot of stuff you have to do with it, like geolocating videos, or with the Europol Trace and Object Stop Child Abuse campaign, where they ask the public to identify objects, we use those kind of outer layers of the community to ask them that simple question. It's like, spot the difference, what is this object? Very simple. If you try to do that on a complex investigation, you have something like the Reddit Boston Marathon bombing investigation, where lots of people on Reddit got together to investigate who was behind the Boston Marathon bombing. And because you had this kind of groupthink occurring, the loudest voices basically were the ones that were listened to. It was a complex investigation. They followed the wrong leads and they identified 2 completely wrong individuals, and it was a mess. So if you're doing a complex investigation, you generally want those kind of inner 3 kind of layers of the Bellingcat onion to be engaged with it, because you can design the processes around that, make sure stuff is being verified, that you don't have this groupthink occurring. And you can combine those two kind of different types of investigation, as we often do with Ukraine, where we might have lots of videos that need to be geolocated, but then that feeds into a much more complicated, in-depth investigation. So that's kind of how we organize.
And collaborating with, let's say, law enforcement, is that something that is also...
If we're asked, if we do an investigation where they come to us and they say, can we have a look at this stuff? We will talk to them about it. We won't go to them and say, hey, what do you want investigating? If we do the work and they're interested, then we're happy to talk to them. It's like with MH17, I was a witness in the investigation. I've submitted stuff to the International Court of Justice, KCHC, all of that stuff.
They came to similar conclusions, but just a few months after you already published your conclusions, which was very striking. We have a question over there. So now
Sure.
you have already the mic. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting and very enjoyable. So the questions I have, it's more of a sort of thoughts out loud. Through your open source investigations, you're producing a lot of data, and there's a lot of complexities around the systems through which the data navigate, and there's multiple layers of interoperability, integration, and so on. So who do you think should be responsible for preserving these various different disparate data sets for the long term? So through your work, you're essentially creating a reliance on this kind of information, right? So for evidence-based investigation and so on. So if this information is to be useful in the future, in fact, taking your example of this, debunking of such a video, so you managed to find the older videos based on which this new sort of, fake video was created. If that video hadn't existed, then you obviously wouldn't have come to that conclusion. So there's definitely a need for preserving this data over the long term. So who should be responsible for that? Is it your company or sort of other organizations or the communities? So I'd be interested in your thoughts around that. The second question I had was related to what you asked about collaborating with the other communities, especially libraries and archives. What could they do to support this, how do I put this, sort of the paradigm or the open source investigation, so through their collection developments or web archiving, so what kind of thing they should be focusing on to sort of support this further? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the Triple Iron Syria example I gave, where they try to create that centralized archive, is a good example of the issues that will be raised if one organization tries to say we're the archiving organization. You're always, I think, going to have a situation where you'll always have small organizations, individuals pop up around, say, a conflict or an ongoing event who is collecting material. What we really need to give them are kind of best practices based off our experience. For example, we have a metadata schema that's been developed around conflict that draws from international humanitarian law, so it can be categorized in a way that fits international humanitarian law rather than just stuff people have kind of tried to figure out along the way. As we're doing this work on this Index for Accountability project, part of that will be working with organizations who have created archives and basically seeing how they've done it. And hopefully they've done it in a way that is fairly easy to kind of either retroactively kind of fit into the metadata schema we want to use, or there's something else we can do there. But we're also going to be going out and training lots of organizations who will be doing archiving at some point in the future. And if then we can say, this is how we've done it in the past, and if you do it this way, we can index it and make it accessible to all these accountability bodies. Hopefully that will get some buy-in from them to actually follow kind of the advice that we're giving them. But you'll never, I think, really ever going to have one organization who's archiving as much as possible. It's always going to be a kind of scattering of organizations, but a lot of it is developing those networks and that community and talking to them about that. I think how the archiving community can be part of that, I think a lot of it is really just having those conversations and sitting down with people and talking to them, because, as I said before, because you've had this kind of parallel development of this separate kind of Syria-led kind of community, I think that hasn't really been very well established. There's a bit of that going on, but I think there could always be more. And it would just help with our understanding of what's already been done. Because the last thing we want to do is reinvent the wheel, because that's a waste of everyone's time.
Time for one more question before we go to the next part of the program. Yeah, there's one on the front row. You can borrow my mic.
Thank you so much. First, thank you so much for your work and everything you're doing. I was curious, this kind of connects to the legal question and also the siloing on social media platforms. Do you run up against issues where there's sort of copyright removals, DMCA removals, legal removals happening on these social media platforms which are affecting your work? And are you ever seeing that either directly affect the content, or are you ever getting involved in these? Like, are people filing bogus copyright takedowns for your content? Because I'm thinking about the many copies of one video circulating.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's a lot of concern at the moment is Elon Musk has announced they're removing old inactive accounts from Twitter. And a lot of those accounts are from activists who died and they can't be active because they're dead, and they're going to lose what's quite important information just because Elon Musk is trying to save more money. And that's really unfortunate. With the work that we were doing on MH17, it really became clear that we had to archive this stuff as we were going, because you never know what's going to be useful in the future. With our process we use for the legal accountability, for example, we actually have plugins in our browsers that archive every single thing we're looking at. It tracks out what we're clicking on, what we're spending time looking at. So we have a very detailed record of that, and it's archived as we go, because stuff can be deleted as you're looking at it. So you have to be really on top of that. What's been quite good to see is more people on social media, especially the kind of Twitter community where a lot of the open source community is, understands that it's important to archive links as you see them. So people will see stuff and they'll go to web archive and stick it on there, and it'll be preserved in some way. And because you have kind of a whole community who understand that, there's usually someone who'll pick something up and do that for you. So it kind of spreads the responsibility of doing that to a certain extent. What we're seeing more and more as well, because we have all these new social media platforms coming out, we have a tech team now that is part of their job is to try and fix all the stuff that gets broken every week on these platforms. For example, Twitter API is now something that's very, very expensive. That's terrible, really, for the work that we do. I mean, there's the whole work about network analysis that's just impossible to do, really, because it's far too expensive. It's having that flexibility to adapt to these new networks. It's like with all these kind of really small kind of micro social media platforms the alt-right loves using, we've created a platform that actually allows you to search a lot of those platforms from one interface and look at things like trend analysis across multiple platforms. So that's kind of one solution to this kind of increasing complexity of social networks. And it stops you just seeing one social network and thinking, okay, this conversation is happening here, and not thinking about all these other micro social networks that could actually be driving that conversation as well.
Thank you so much. This is all we have time for. A big round of applause for Eliot.